With Rob Bertini and Jennifer Dill, we kind of co-organized this seminar. So today we have Carl Batten from ECONorthwest today to present about the Oregon Highway Cost Allocation Study. So I've been working on the review team with this study with Carl, so interested to see the presentation. And just a reminder, if you have questions, to use the microphones on the table. So with that, welcome, Carl.
Thank you. Originally, we had intended to schedule this seminar after the results from the current Oregon Highway Cost Allocation Study were ready. For a variety of reasons, they aren't ready yet. So I'll talk more about highway cost allocation in general and how it's done in Oregon, and present some results from the last study 2 years ago. Highway cost allocation attempts to answer the question, do various categories of highway users pay user fees in proportion to the costs they impose on the highway system? So there's actually a lot more to it than just allocating costs. First, you need to define user classes. Then you allocate the cost to those user classes. And then you also have to attribute revenue to user classes, which can be as complicated as allocating costs. And then calculate equity ratios, which are the final answer of the study. And each user class has an equity ratio, which is actually a ratio of ratios. It's their share of revenue over their share of costs. And if it's 1.0, that means they're paying exactly their fair share. If it's more than 1, it means they're paying too much. If it's less than 1, it means they're not paying enough. The most important question in figuring out how to do highway cost allocation is, what is the cost? It could be the costs that are imposed by users on the system, or it could be the expenditures that are made by the agencies that manage the system to keep the system functioning. What generally happens is that the amount of dollars that are allocated is the amount of expenditures, and then we attempt to allocate those dollars based on the shares of costs imposed by various users. Another question is, over what time period? Historically, cost allocation studies have generally looked at expenditures in a short, near-term, discrete time period, and they've allocated those costs out to the users who will be using them over that same time, short, near-term time period. The problem with that is that part of the expenditures are for assets that can have very long useful lives. So if you build a bridge that's going to last 100 years, you include the cost of that bridge in a cost allocation study that covers a 2-year period, and then you forget about that bridge in all your future cost allocations for the next 98 years, even though it's still sitting there, still being used, still being consumed. And as a result, if the mix of types of projects changes from one time period to the next, the cost allocation study results can change, even though the actual costs and the actual revenues aren't changing. Another complication in defining what's a cost is the role of funding. The Oregon Highway Cost Allocation Study is charged with looking at the expenditures of the state's highway fund, which is filled up from user fees on the highway system, the gas tax, the weight mile tax, and so on. But the projects that fund is expended on are also funded by federal funds and for local government projects from their own source funds. And the mix of funds on any particular project can vary. They're basically, the money gets put into a big bucket and then ladled out to projects. And at the state level, they do track that funding, but it's arbitrary. And at the local level, they don't even track it very well. And then there's the question of external costs. costs like noise and pollution and so on that are imposed by highway users, but don't really affect the expenditure of funds on the highway system. And so there's always a question of whether those costs should be included. So once you've decided what costs you're going to allocate, you need a basis for allocating them to user groups. You have to find some measurable parameter that varies with cost responsibility. And I'll go over what some of those that are typically used. And at a higher level, there's different ways of thinking about assigning cost responsibility. There's the incremental approach, the consumption approach, the marginal cost approach, and simple apportionment. The incremental approach has been used for decades, really, since highway cost allocation was first done, and it's still used for bridges in Oregon. The way the incremental cost approach works is you look at the cost of building a structure that will handle your basic vehicle class, and you allocate the costs of that structure to all of the vehicles that use the facility. Then you look at the additional cost of building a sturdier structure that can handle heavier vehicles, and you allocate the increment, the difference between the cost of the sturdier structure and the cost of the basic structure, to those heavier vehicles. And you can have as many different increments as you like. This is the way bridges are still done. It used to be the way pavements and other construction-type expenditures were allocated. The consumption approach is what we use now for pavement. The idea is that pavement is laid down on a road, and then as users pass over the road, they use up the life of that pavement. The more vehicles pass over a road in a given time period, the shorter the useful life of that pavement will be. And the amount of wear and tear goes up super proportionally with weight. To do that, you have to have a detailed engineering model. For pavement, the National Pavement Cost Model, called NAPCOM, was developed in the 1990s. It was put together with data that had been collected over about a 30-year period, where they built a 5-mile oval track and drove trucks around in circles for years. And it's a very detailed model. It looks at all the different types of deterioration that can occur in pavement, cracking and spalling and rutting and so on, and figures out how different mixes of traffic of different weights damage the pavement, taking into account things like freezing and thawing and so on. The National Pavement Cost Model was adapted to highway cost allocation for the 1997 Federal Highway Cost Allocation study by Roger Mingo, and he's further adapted it to fit Oregon's data requirements. The consumption approach is really only applicable to wear-related costs, and it's used in Oregon for allocating the costs of pavement preservation and maintenance. Another approach is the marginal cost approach. This is one that economists like, but that never actually gets used. And one way to approach marginal cost pricing is to think about, what if every vehicle on the road paid a fee to be there based on where they were, when they were there, and how much they weighed. So if a vehicle wants to enter a congested roadway, they will have to pay more because they'll be imposing costs on all the other users by slowing them down. If you want to drive a heavy vehicle that does more pavement damage, you'll have to pay more than if you want to be in a light vehicle. And so if you could make people pay that way, then you could figure out how much each user class ended up paying. And you could allocate costs in proportion to how much they would end up paying under such a scheme. So that's the efficient pricing approach. And it's something that we'll be doing as an alternative in the current cost allocation study. And it'll be presented in an appendix to the main report. There's a variety of apportionment methods. These are basically accounting methods rather than economic methods for allocating costs to users. For capacity-related costs, there's a measure of capacity called passenger car equivalence. And it's a measure of how much space on the roadway a vehicle takes up relative to the space that a standard passenger car takes up. So standard passenger cars have a PCE of 1. Larger or slower vehicles have a higher PCE. The PCEs are also used in the capacity calculation in volume capacity ratios that are used in highway design and in the volume delay functions that are used in travel demand models. And there's a whole range of PCEs depending on the circumstances. The type of road you're on can make a difference in the relative amount of space different types of vehicles take up, the number of lanes, the width of the lanes, sight distance, the amount of congestion, whether or not it's uphill. The uphill PCEs can get really high for trucks that have a low horsepower to weight ratio. And then there's vehicle miles traveled, the most popular apportionment method around. Vehicle miles traveled can be used alone to allocate costs that don't vary by weight. So each user gets an equal share of the cost that you're allocating for every mile they travel on the system. They're also used to weight the other allocators like PCEs or pavement factors and so on. And they can be used to spread costs within a subset of user classes. So you can use VMT to spread the costs of motor carrier division administration among the heavy vehicles that motor carrier division regulates. There are some costs that just don't vary with use, so there's no real reasonable basis for allocating them to user classes. But they have to be allocated out nonetheless. There are two ways that that's typically done. One of them is in proportion to VMT. And the other is in proportion to how the other costs were allocated, which is basically the same as ignoring them. What's typically done in Oregon is that overhead costs that are related to construction are allocated in proportion to the way the construction costs were allocated. The other costs, like the maintaining the computers in the central services that serve DMV and ODOT, are allocated to all users based on VMT. And there's a very large dollar amount that ends up being allocated that way. Planning gets allocated that way, the director and his staff, and so on. There's a different approach that's available for allocating unallocable costs that economists like. It's been used for at least 30 years to incorporate the fixed costs into utility pricing. It's called Ramsey pricing, and the way it works is that your share of the unallocable costs is in inverse proportion to your elasticity of demand. And what that does is it makes the people whose use is least affected by prices pay a larger share of the cost. So it has the least distorting effect on use. And because it has the least distorting effect on use, it's the most economically efficient way to collect that money that needs to be collected. It doesn't work very well for highway costs because the elasticities of demand for highway use tend to vary more within weight classes than between weight classes. You have people driving around in cars who are willing to pay very high prices. Their demand is very inelastic because they have to get to work on time. You have other people out for a Sunday afternoon drive who, if you raise their price, just wouldn't do it. And same thing within trucks. You have trucks who have to get to a certain place at a certain time, and they'll pay whatever it takes to get there. You have other trucks who can bypass the state entirely if they want to, because they aren't even going anywhere in Oregon. So there's a huge variation within each weight class, and it's a much larger variation than the average for any given weight class. Or, I mean, for the average between weight classes. Yeah. Oregon was one of the first states to ever do highway cost allocation. The first study was in 1937. And they were done periodically since then, but not on any regular schedule. In 1999, the state constitution was amended to require a highway cost allocation study every 2 years and to require the adjustment of revenue sources if necessary. And the question that needs to be answered for the purpose of meeting the constitutional requirement is, are the share of revenues paid by light and heavy vehicles proportionate to their share of costs? The highway cost allocation study that gets done can answer a lot more questions than that, but that's the one that is required by the Constitution. Before 1999, the highway cost allocation studies were all performed by ODOT staff. In 1999, the 1999 study, which was actually conducted in 1998 before the constitutional requirement, was done by Cambridge Systematics with Joe Stowers. And Joe Stowers was the one who was the principal investigator for the federal highway cost allocation study in 1997. They applied the 1997 federal model to Oregon, and with that brought a number of improvements over the way highway cost allocation had been done in the past in Oregon. For the 2001 study, Jack Fawcett Associates was the prime contractor, and EcoNorthwest was a subcontractor, and it ended up that we developed an entirely new model for Oregon because of some limitations and differences between the way things are done in Oregon with the weight mile tax and the way the federal cost allocation study was designed. And I ended up being the one who developed that model for Oregon. Some of the differences between the federal model and the Oregon model are that in Oregon, the trucks that pay the weight mile tax are divided into 2,000-pound weight increments, and there's a different rate for each 200,000-pound increment. In the federal study, the trucks were divided into 5,000-pound increments based on their registered weight. So things didn't line up very well. And in the Oregon model, it goes on 2,000-pound weight increments, and it's by declared weight rather than by registered weight. The declared weight is the weight that a truck declares to be operating under when they pay the weight mile tax, and it can be different than their registered weight. And it's what determines the rate they pay. And a single tractor can operate under multiple declared weights depending on what kinds of trailers it's pulling at the moment. So that was all taken into account in the Oregon model, as well as a number of other changes. For the 2003 study, ODOT staff did the study using the model developed for the 2001 study. And for the 2005 study, EcoNorthwest is the prime contractor, and it's the model developed for the 2001 study is being updated. Some of the decisions that Oregon has made and some of the approaches they take, the costs that are allocated are the expenditures over the upcoming biennium. So it's a 2-year period, and it's in the future from when the study is done. The expenditures of federal funds are included, and they are weighted equally with the expenditure of state funds. And the reason for that is that the federal funds and state funds are equally available for pretty much any project at the state level. The state people who do the accounting for that change it around all the time, and to meet different goals. One of the things they do is they try to fund preservation projects almost entirely with federal money, and which frees up state money for capital projects, which which is a politically expedient thing to do, because then they can tell the legislators, look what we spent the money you gave us on. Here it is. It's something you can see. It's a project you wanted us to do. But it doesn't have to be that way. So to not end up jerking around the cost allocation results based on decisions that can change from one day to the next within ODOT's accounting department, the federal funds are treated equally with the state funds. Now, the part of the highway fund money gets distributed out to local governments. Some of it goes to counties and some of it goes to cities, and then it gets spread out from there. And since it's state highway user fees that are being spent, we look at the expenditures by local governments of the state funds. But the local governments don't really know how they spent the state funds, because it all gets mixed in with federal funds they receive directly and with their own source funds. So we also include expenditures by local governments of federal and own source revenues. An issue that came up in the 2003 study for the first time, really, and is a much bigger issue in the current study and looking forward, is bond financing. In the past, Oregon didn't do much bond financing, and it was pretty much ignored in the highway cost allocation. In the future, a large portion of expenditures will be expenditures of money that was raised by selling bonds, and the user fees that go towards paying off those bonds will be collected over the 20 years hence. And the way Oregon has decided to treat those expenditures is to take the portion of the bond revenue that will be repaid within the upcoming biennium, which is about 16% of it, and use that dollar amount rather than the full amount that was expended during the biennium for those projects. And then the allocated 16% gets carried forward and added into the allocated costs of each of the next 9 studies. Bridge costs in Oregon use the incremental approach, and bridge costs are a big issue because a large part of this big OTIA 3 bond expenditures on bridges. In 2002, OBEC, which is, I think, is Oregon Bridge Engineering Consultants, did a study for the Oregon Highway Cost Allocation to look at the costs of building bridges for basic vehicles, bridges for vehicles up to 26,000 pounds, vehicles up to 50,000 pounds, vehicles up to 100,000 pounds, and vehicles up to 200,000 pounds. And the results of that study are used to allocate the bridge costs in the Oregon study. They also looked at 3 different bridge designs. There was a relatively short single-span bridge, a long single-span bridge, and a 3-span bridge. So all of the bridges that get built get matched up as closely as possible to one of those 3, and the allocators for those are used. The wear-related pavement costs use the federal pavement model, which was adapted to Oregon by Roger Mingo. That adaptation included making it work on 2,000-pound weight increments and using the results of Oregon's special weighings studies to get the distribution of the different types of vehicles by axle configuration and weight. The special weighings they do in Oregon are a couple times a year at a certain set of weigh stations. They'll require every single truck that passes that weigh station to get weighed, where in normal operations, empty trucks can bypass, and trucks with transponders can use the weigh-in-motion system. But during the special weighing, every truck gets weighed. Each axle, you get a weight for each axle group and a count of the number of axles in each group. And that information is used to generate the pavement cost factors that we use in the study. Other expenditures related to added capacity are allocated with peak period VMT weighted PCEs. So it's PCEs that are specific to congested conditions weighted by peak period VMT. So the assumption there is that if you're adding capacity, it's probably in response to congestion. And so you want to look at what users are present during the congested periods and how much capacity is each of them taking up. Climbing lanes are allocated with uphill PCEs. And studded tire damage is allocated entirely to basic vehicles. So ODOT develops an estimate of how much they spend to repair studded tire damage, and that dollar amount is taken out of the categories that they spend it in and moved into a special category that's allocated entirely to basic vehicles. And the reason for that is that only basic vehicles are allowed to have studded tires. Other construction-related expenditures are allocated as overhead, and just about everything else is allocated in proportion to VMT. Now, in putting together the equity ratios, Oregon takes a look at vehicles that pay rates other than the standard rate. There are reduced registration fees for a variety of classes of vehicles, including farm vehicles, nonprofit vehicles, publicly owned vehicles, and so on. There are vehicles like farm vehicles that are exempt from the weight mile tax and pay the fuel tax instead. And there are diesel-powered publicly owned vehicles that don't pay any fuel tax or weight mile tax. There are also certain classes of vehicles that can pay a flat fee rather than the weight mile tax. Log trucks, dump trucks, and wood chip trucks. And so for all of these alternative fee-paying vehicles, we determine what they would have paid if they were treated as a normal vehicle. And the difference is considered a subsidy. And then that subsidy amount is then treated as a cost and allocated in proportion to VMT by full feed paying vehicles. Something that we did in the 2001 study and are doing again in the 2005 study is called the Dualpath approach, where we do the usual highway cost allocation study, and it gets presented in the main volume of the report. And then we do an alternative study, sometimes referred to as the shining path, where the types of allocation procedures that economists like best are applied, and the results are compared to the traditional approach. In the 2001 study, the final results were very similar. And in the shining path, wear and tear costs are the dollar amount is the dollar amount of cost imposed rather than the amount that happened to be budgeted for expenditure in the upcoming biennium. And the allocation method is the same. Capacity-related costs are allocated on the basis of what efficient fee revenues would be. And asset costs are amortized over the useful life of the asset rather than just the current biennium or the bond life. In the current study, there are several issues that are getting a lot of attention. One of them is the allocation of the cost of replacement bridges. In the federal study, they treated replacement bridges differently than new bridges, looking at the portion of replacement bridges that were replaced in order to serve heavier trucks. If the current bridge was inadequate to serve the truck traffic that wanted to be going there, they gave the cost of making the bridge bigger for heavier trucks to the trucks. In Oregon, there's a lot of replacement bridges that are scheduled for the next few years, and there's a lot of controversy over whether heavy trucks should pay a higher proportion of the cost of those bridges than they would under the normal incremental approach. So there are two key questionings to determining whether they should. One of those is, did the presence of heavy trucks on existing bridges lead to their premature failure? A lot of the existing bridges were designed for trucks that are lighter than many of the trucks that operate on Oregon's roads today. It was a 72,000-pound design vehicle, and the standard truck out there today has a declared weight of 80,000, and trucks can operate without special permits up to 105,500 pounds and can operate with special permits at higher weights than that. The other question is, will the presence of heavy trucks on the replacement bridges shorten their expected life? And that's a question that could be applied to a new bridge as well. Engineers generally tell us that they believe that the answer to both questions is yes, but they can't say by how much. And since they can't say by how much, we can't really include those in the study. At least we haven't found a reasonable way of doing so. So for now, replacement bridges are treated the same as if they were a new bridge. Another big issue is revenues other than state user fees. Since the purpose of the study is to allocate the state user fees, it often doesn't seem quite right to be including all of these funds from other sources. But we've concluded that we really have to because of the fungibility issue. And on the local government side, because of the accounting issues, they don't even, most local governments don't even attempt to track where the money came from for a particular project. At the state level, they do account, but it's arbitrary. Another big issue is the bond finance projects, as I mentioned before. The amount of expenditure in a given biennium doesn't match the expenditure of user fees in that biennium. So the question of, earlier we talked about the difference between a cost and an expenditure. Now it gets down to what's an expenditure. They certainly spend the money on projects, but it's money that they borrowed from someone else rather than expenditure of user fees. And then there's the money comes in from the bonds and goes into the pool of money that's available to fund projects. The choice of which projects to finance is arbitrary or somewhat arbitrary, but it can make a difference in the result of the cost allocation study if different projects have different levels of responsibility by different classes of vehicles. And finally, the expenditure-based history of cost allocation in Oregon makes transition difficult. Ideally, you would want to transition to a method where you amortize the cost of a capital project over its expected useful life. But without being able to go back and figure out the current period's share of costs of all of the existing capital out there, it's very difficult to make that transition. Issues that aren't important yet but are likely to become important in future studies are how to allocate the costs of toll-financed facilities. There are proposals for some of those, including some work on Highway 217 that may be toll-financed. New revenue instruments. There are proposals for various forms of vehicle mile taxes as an alternative to the fuel tax, especially as gasoline-powered vehicles become less popular and hybrids and electric vehicles become more popular. The gas tax may not do what it once did for those. External costs are always an issue, and people will be pressing those harder and harder for inclusion. And then there's the issue of non-highway investments to relieve congestion. If highway user fee money is spent on something other than highways in order to relieve congestion, the highway users presumably could benefit just as much as if capacity were added. So it's a reasonable way to spend that money, but there's no way to include it in the highway cost allocation under the present framework. We wouldn't be needing to do highway cost allocation at all if we charge people the right prices. So efficient pricing is a scheme where each vehicle is charged according to where and when it travels and how much it actually weighs. And under such a scheme, the total amount of revenue collected will equal the optimal total expenditure. And you can have a sinking fund to absorb the lumpiness in expenditure. And that's assuming that you you make the right investment decisions and do the right level of maintenance. The technology necessary for efficient pricing is advancing rapidly. There's a demonstration project getting underway in the Puget Sound area that is using onboard devices on vehicles with GPS to tell the device exactly where it is. It's hooked into the car's computer that controls the engine and transmission, so it knows how fast it's going and so on. And then it also has basically a roadmap inside it, so that it knows what facility it's on, and it communicates with a control computer that tells it what the price is for each mile on that facility at that time. For trucks, you can have the same device and also scales built into the axles that tell you what the load on each axle is at the time. And with these onboard systems, the only thing that needs to be communicated to Big Brother is how many dollars worth of user fees you've incurred. The devices can keep records of everything else in case you're audited, but by keeping all of the data and calculations on the vehicle, most of the privacy concerns can be addressed because that information isn't communicated to anyone else under normal circumstances. Now, we don't have results of the 2005 study yet. We were hoping that we would by now. But I'll give a brief summary of the results of the 2003 study. Looking at basic vehicles, they had about 31.5 billion vehicle miles of travel. That's annual vehicle miles of travel in the biennium that we're in right now, the 03-05. They were assigned almost $1 billion worth of annual cost responsibility, and that includes responsibility for federal and local own source funds. And they paid about $450 million into the highway fund, and they were given a $9 million share of the subsidy. And their equity ratio came out to 0.992, which is basically 1. So there's no constitutional requirement to change user fees as a result of that study. Medium vehicles are the ones between 8 and 26,000 pounds. They had only 598 million miles of travel. They imposed $35 million of annual cost and paid $23 million of user fees and ended up with a 1.3 equity ratio. Heavy vehicles is everything over 26,000 pounds. They had 1.8 billion miles of travel each year in Oregon. They had a $450 million annual cost responsibility and paid $210 million in user fees each year and ended up with a 0.987 equity ratio, which means they were paying almost their fair share, but not quite. And within the different classes of heavy vehicles, the equity ratios range from 0.26 for some of the heavier vehicles to 2.10. So there's a huge disparity within different classes of heavy vehicles as far as whether they're paying their fair share or not. 63% of the heavy miles are in trucks in the 80,000 pound weight class. And they had an equity ratio of 1.09, indicating they're paying about 9% too much. The second largest group of heavy trucks is the very top end 105,500 pound vehicles, and they had an equity ratio of 0.76, indicating that they were definitely not paying as much as they should. Questions? Tara?
Were there changes as a result of like that 0.76 ratio and the 1.38 ratio in the, I guess that'd be the last study?
There were changes in heavy vehicle rates. I don't know if it's fair to say that they were in response to the study or if they even intended to make the distribution fairer. I think they were primarily forward-looking for the funding of OTIA 3. They increased the heavy truck registration fees in order to pay for what they anticipated was a larger truck responsibility with all the new bridges that were going to be built.
To what extent did the trucking industry participate in this?
The trucking industry has a representative on the study review team who attends all the meetings and takes a very active role in the process. The American Automobile Association also has a representative who attends all the same meetings and participates actively as well.
I have a question I'm not sure if you'll know about, and I actually don't know the full name of. There's some new accounting guidelines. The acronym is GASB, G-A-S-B, that has something to do with the way public agencies are going to need to account for their infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know anything about these, and if so, does it relate to this cost allocation at all? Because you were talking about sort of the life of a project and how you account for that on the books.
That sort of information would certainly be useful if you were to take into account the useful life of the assets. That type of accounting is designed to make you be able to do that. And once it's fully implemented and has been around for the life of the structures that are out there, it would make the use of that a lot easier in highway cost allocation.
I just wanted to see if you wanted to comment on studded tires and also give some examples. You mentioned external costs, and maybe you could give some examples, and also non-highway improvements to increase capacity. Give some examples there too.
Okay. First, studded tires. When a vehicle with studded tires travels down a road, the metal studs strike the pavement and break off little bits of pavement. The wear that they do is much faster than a rubber tire traveling over the same road with the same weight on it. The amount of studded tire damage is proportional to the square of speed. So where you really see it is on freeways that are heavily traveled by cars with studded tires. And if you've driven between Portland and Salem on the stretches where they haven't recently repaved, you'll see ruts in the pavement. And those are caused by studded tires, and you'll see them in the left lane as well as the right lanes where the trucks are. And you'll see them in concrete, which basically doesn't get rutted from rubber tires, but studded tires can dig ruts even in concrete. So that greatly accelerates the damage and shortens the amount of time between when you have to repave a road. And the extra cost of that then gets attributed to the basic vehicle class, because they're the only ones who do have studded tires. The next question was external costs. There are a variety of external costs that are imposed on people by the use of the highway system. There's air pollution, noise, water pollution, and damage to fish and wildlife if the facilities, for example, prevent fish passage. And some of those costs are borne by the agencies responsible for the highway system when they do something to mitigate those costs. So if they replace a culvert with a bridge in order to let the fish go through, the cost of that is borne by the agency. If they build a sound wall to keep the sound out of a residential neighborhood, then that cost is borne by the agency. But a large part of the costs are borne by society as a whole, and not by the agency that collects or spends the user fees. So people have made the argument that the costs imposed by users should be accounted for in highway cost allocation to the extent that it makes a difference if one class of users is imposing those costs at a different rate than another class. And the third?
Non-highway investments.
Non-highway investments. When a facility becomes congested, users benefit by adding capacity to that facility so they can get to where they're going at a reasonable speed. And users generally are willing to pay to add that capacity. But if instead of adding capacity, you provided an alternative means of people to get from point A to point B, or you've provided a means for people to get there in a smaller number of vehicles, then you would be reducing capacity just as much, and it could be more efficient to make that alternative investment. But that investment may be outside of the highway system. Transit is a common example. Spending money on transit instead of on more highway lanes to relieve congestion is something that can be done. It typically isn't done with highway funds in Oregon because of the constitutional limitations on how they can be spent. But that may change in the future. And there are other proposals out there. People talk about taking money that would be spent on additional lanes and using it to pay people to carpool.
A couple questions. The allocation.
Use the microphone. Oh,
Yeah,
you are.
listen
Okay.
now. What you've been describing is really an allocation model, but it doesn't go to the question of are adequate enough funds being raised. I assume that that's the case, that this is really more of an exercise in making sure that the modeling that drives who's going to pay for based on the rates that currently exist is done properly. Is that correct? Is that
That's
a correct
correct.
interpretation?
It's an accounting exercise primarily, though in the shining path alternative, we attempt to go beyond that. We try to look at how much should be collected and how much should be spent, and who should be contributing to that.
Right. And then, as a follow-up, in looking at the numbers you had from 2003, is it fair to say, for instance, with basic vehicles, is it fair to make this comparison that essentially the user fees paid represent less than half of the annual cost responsibility? In other words, the current system of cost recovery is not approaching full cost recovery at all under the based on these numbers.
Well, the total cost responsibility for all vehicles is substantially larger than the state user fees collected, but somebody is paying those, and in the case of the federal money, it's almost entirely from federal user fees. There's a federal gas tax that you pay in addition to your state gas tax, and there are federal taxes on trucks as well. So it's not like they aren't. I guess what I'm trying to say is that difference doesn't represent an insufficiency of funding. It's just the difference between the sources of funds that we look at in adding up all the expenditures, and then the single source of funds that we look at on the revenue side.
Okay, so the 944.5 here is the total cost, all sources, and the 455 is the allocation of the state source for the state share of the total cost.
Right. The 944 is the basic vehicle's share of the expenditure of revenue from all sources, and the 455 is the state user fees that the basic vehicles paid.
One last one. Is it possible, is there an information source that has, in effect, the full accounting, like a complete matrix that shows vehicle types, the cost side from all sources and the revenue side from all sources?
In the 2001 study, we put together some tables that included the different vehicles' contribution to federal user fees. The only piece that would be missing is local owned source, and the great bulk of local owned source aren't really vehicle user fees. They're property taxes and system development charges and traffic impact fees and whatever else that don't really come from vehicle use.
You talked about damage from studded tires.
Yes.
Were you able to quantify that, and how does that damage compare to, say, damage to bridges by heavy trucks?
The ODOT does studies to quantify studded tire damage, although it's not what we call studded tire damage in the highway cost allocation study isn't really the amount of damage they do. It's the amount that's expended to repair the damage they do. And ODOT estimates that periodically. And about 4 years ago, they did a study that also estimated the actual amount of damage that studded tires were doing that is greater than the amount they expend to repair the damage. In other words, there's a fair amount of unrepaired studded tire damage out there. The amount is that they come up with, I think, is about trying to remember. I think it's around $10 million a year, and that's a relatively small number in compared to all of the other costs. You asked specifically about the amount of damage that trucks do to bridges, and that's something that we don't address at all in the highway cost allocation study. We look at the difference in what it costs to build a bridge that can stand up to heavy trucks compared to the cost of a bridge that can't. We don't look at the amount of bridge life that's consumed by a heavy truck going over the bridge. We would like to be able to do that, but the engineers just aren't there yet as far as being able to tell us how much that is.
Just to follow up to that, I guess for damage from studded tires, is there a way to track that? I mean, that should be pretty easy in terms of who is putting on studded tires and how long they keep them on.
In the cost allocation study, we don't divide the basic vehicle group into those who use studded tires and those who don't. Everyone who drives a car, light truck, or SUV pays a share of the cost of studded tire damage, whether they actually put studded tires on or not. People have proposed having a fee for studded tires that would recover the cost and that would go towards repairing the damage. If such a fee existed, then that all could be incorporated in highway cost allocation, and there would be a source of money to repair the damage, but such a fee doesn't exist. There is some charge that is associated with studded tires that the people who install them have to pay, but it's nothing. It's not proportional to the amount of damage they do.
We're actually, the clock on the wall is wrong. We're actually past 1 o'clock, so I'm going to suggest that we have to wrap it up. And before we thank our speaker, next week there's been a change to the schedule. Our own Rob Bertini is going to be the speaker next week talking about congestion. But right now, let's thank our speaker. And if you didn't get to ask your question, you can either talk to you or then give me a paper copy if you're a student. Oh, okay.